Welcome to our History 202, Arts of Africa, Oceania, and the Americas. In this lesson, we're going to study the Edo Kingdom of Benin. The arts of the Edo Kingdom of Benin are some of the most famous and well-preserved works of African art in international collections. The Edo Kingdom of Benin, sometimes called just Benin, is in West Africa in the southeast part of modern-day Nigeria. So we're looking at Nigeria here, and here is Benin City in the former Edo Kingdom of Benin. The city of Benin, capital of the Edo Kingdom, is located in a humid tropical forest in southern Nigeria. And although the city is now a small provincial town, it was once one of the most important commercial and artistic centers in the entire continent. The Kingdom of Benin had been known to Europe since the 15th century, when the Portuguese came to the region seeking to trade. Portuguese accounts of that time tell us of the wealth of the Kingdom of Benin and its natural resources such as gold, ivory, and pepper, which the Europeans came looking for in order to preserve food, as well as slaves. When the Europeans first came to the Kingdom of Benin in the 15th century, they admired it and they compared it to the city of contemporary Haarlem, a prosperous Dutch trading city. In this image, produced by the Dutch, we see a court ceremony with an oba or king, musicians and attendants, as well as tame leopards over here. In the middle ground, back here, we see the royal palace, which is with its turrets capped with brass birds, and we see one here, here, and here. And in the background is the city of Benin, which was a trading center and the religious capital of the Edo Kingdom. Now, much of what you encounter of Royal Benin art in international collections was looted by the British. In 1897, a group of British officials were killed in Benin because they had trespassed onto the grounds of the royal palace during a ceremony honoring the royal ancestors. Now, the British retaliated by launching what is now known as the Punitive Expedition. They seized the city and burned down all the wooden buildings and took off with over 3,000 pieces of royal artifacts. The British kept some of the loot for themselves and then sold the rest to museums and galleries. And in this photograph, we see members of the Punitive Expedition proudly posing with the looted goods in the Royal Palace of Benin in 1987. So this is how many of the artworks from the Royal Palace in Benin actually ended up in museums both in Europe and the United States. Many scholars see a link between the Ife, which we cover in a previous lecture, and Benin. And perhaps, as some scholars surmise, the roots of Benin culture lay in the Ife. In Benin culture, the most important person is the king, called the Oba, and it was believed that he was a divine figure, a living god. There's still an Oba today who remains a living god to his people, though he does not have political power like his predecessors did. In Benin, there was a tradition of creating highly stylized, life-sized brass heads of the Oba, and we're looking at an example here on our screen. Now, each king or Oba had his own stylized head cast. So while these are not photorealistic portraits as we know them, they are portraits representing the Oba's divine nature, his metaphysical power, and therefore his divinely sanctioned right to rule. Now, this sculpture is made out of brass, and Benin traded for brass with European traders. This was one of their primary luxury materials. And all of the heads of these Oba heads are made by the last wax process. They're hollow and they have a circular opening at the top of the head, and we could see it in this particular head right over here. And we'll see in one of the next slides how this hole was actually used. Brass was prized in Benin for its shininess and red color, which was believed to distance evil. And although these heads are now kind of dull and dark in color, when new, shiny brass is actually red. And red is a very important color in Benin, as we'll see in also in this lecture. Brass was associated with the royal family, and it was the Oba and the Queen Mother. It was their prerogative to commission brass castings. Now, the brass heads were predominantly displayed on altars dedicated to the royal ancestors outside of the royal palace, and we're looking at an example of them here. This was a public space, so this displays reaffirmed the Oba's power over his subjects. The palace has been rebuilt after the British burned it in 1897, and it is a shadow really of its former self, but one, at least at the altars, has been redone, and the tradition of the ancestor altars or shrines continues today. And as you can see in this image, the Oba's heads, the cast heads, also held intricately carved elephant tusks. So these coming out of the heads are elephant tusks. So that big hole in the head, that's where the tusk would fit right in. And ivory was another luxury material associated with royalty in Benin. Now, ivory is associated with the Oba because number one is material so hard and durable that ivory represents the longevity that the Benin people wish for their Oba. Now, the elephant is strong, so it represents the physical power of an ideal Oba. And because ivory is expensive, it represents the Oba's wealth. Because ivory is white, it is also a symbol of purity. Now, most of the ivory objects from Benin that are outside of Benin have been allowed to yellow with age, but in Benin, they would have been bleached with lemon juice and rubbed with chalk to keep them white. Now, notice also the bamboo branches on the altar, and these are the ones here on the right image, and the brown. And these refer to the continuation of the royal line with each notch in the branch. Now, these heads are signifier of former Oba's prosperity, military and political success, authority, and wisdom. In Benin culture, just as we saw with the Ife, the head is the seat of character, judgment, and intelligence. Public ceremonies were performed annually to fortify the living Oba's head, which was believed to make him a more effective leader. The earliest heads, such as the one we're looking at in the screen, date to the 15th century. And these heads are of thinly cast brass, which is appropriate considering the scarcity of brass at the time. And this will actually change as brass became more available through trade with the Portuguese. Now the heads are marked by highly stylized realism. The cheeks present scarification patterns, so we see them here on both sides of his mouth. The neck is obscured by rows of representing coral beads here. And coral was sacred to the royal family of Benin and was traded for with the Mediterranean. It was made into beads and worn in necklaces or sometimes as crowns. And in this particular head, it may appear to be a hairstyle, but most scholars think that is actually a headdress made out of rows of coral beads. Now, only members of the Oba's immediate family and high-ranking ministers were allowed to possess coral. Crowns and necklaces of coral beads are part of the established emblems of Benin kingship. Now, coral beads are said to enhance the king's powers, and coral was sacred for its red color, resembling blood, and the red of the coral beads serve as a reminder that only the king can order the death sentence. It also recalls the king's blood links to his people, which is a call to temper his rule. And coral is also associated with the god Olokun, who's the god of water. And this is significant because the Oba, or the king, claims descent from Olokun, so that god of water, which then legitimizes his rule. Now, in this early head, the irises were also made out of iron, and this originally gave the eyes of the Oba a shocking, authoritative stare, conveying his divinity. And iron was also believed to be associated with a powerful god, the god of iron, Ogun, who was associated with warfare, agriculture, and rulership, which of course would have all been very good associations for the Oba. In addition, we also see these indents and these parallel indents in the forehead, and iron bars would have been encrusted there, and they would have, the idea is that they would have made the head stronger, as iron was sacred and powerful, and they would have represented scarification. Now, as time went on, the Oba heads, or the brass heads, changed during the 16th century as the Portuguese became a greater trading presence. Benin began to import more brass, so the heads become thicker and more detailed during this century, as the example we see on the screen. And the neck is also completely obscured up to the lower lip with more rows of coral beads. And there's also a netted coral crown on his head, which we see here And this is an actual example of something that probably looked very much like what he is wearing or what the head is wearing on the left side image. Now, Oba heads dating to the mid-18th and 19th century display even more elongated necks and more ornate coral crowns, as we see here in this image on the screen. Now, this head, as well as others, have projections along the ova's face and above the crown. So I'm talking about these projections here right below, from the crown right below to the eye, and then above as well. And these are said to resemble the side flippers and antenna of the mudfish. And throughout West Africa, the mudfish is a symbol of peace, prosperity, and fertility. And because the mudfish lives close to the riverbank, it symbolizes the ova's position between mortal men, being the land, and the spirit world, and the divine world of his ancestor Olokun, the god of water. So it kind of symbolizes the position of the Oba as kind of this intermediary between both realms. The mudfish is also praised for its ability to survive in the toughest conditions. During a drought, a mudfish will burrow in the mud, allowing it to survive for long periods of time until the rain comes. Thus, the mudfish is a symbol of survival across West Africa. These are modern and contemporary images of Benin Oba Akenzua II, who began the difficult task of asking for the return of the Benin bronzes from the English, who had taken them during the punitive expedition of 1897. And we see him here wearing some of the paraphernalia that we see also in some of the Oba heads we've been looking on, such as the red coral headdress over here, both of the images. He also wears the coral necklaces, as well as a shirt that, of course, we can't see in the heads. But the coral was supposed to remind him of and his people of his descent from the god Olokun, as I mentioned, the god of water, as well as his connection to his people, and his role as judge and the only one who could give out a death sentence. Now, another important set of sculptures we find in the ancestral altars of palaces are those of the Queen Mother. And we're looking at an example here on our screen. And in the Benin Kingdom, the Queen Mother, who is known as the Yoba, occupies an important, historically significant place within Benin's political hierarchy. Now, the title of Queen Mother was first conferred upon a queen of Benin, Idia, who lived in the 16th century. And Idia was the mother of one Oba named Eseji, and he is one of Benin's most celebrating kings. Idia, his mother, was remembered for having used her political skill and supernatural abilities to save her son and his kingdom. Now, ever since that time, Queen mothers have been considered powerful protectors of their sons and, by extension, of the kingdom itself. Because of the enormous esteem in which they are held, Iobas enjoy privileges second only to the Oba himself. They have a separate palace, a retinue of female attendants, and they also have the right to commission cast brass sculptures for religious or personal use. The heads of the queen mothers are distinguished from those of kings by the forward-pointing peaks of their coral beaded knitted crowns, as we see here, right? So we see the kind of the forward pointing peak. Now this is a very famous work from Benin, known as the Benin chest mask, and it was carved out of ivory during the 16th century, and it depicts the head of the Queen Mother Iria, the woman I just mentioned to you as kind of the first Queen Mother for whom the office was created. Now her son, the Oba Esigi, probably wore the mask hanging at his side for a ceremony honoring his mother. And pendant masks such as this were worn over a tie on the costume on the left hip. So kind of like the equivalent of a belt buckle. Even though it is a face mask, it probably was never worn on the face. And the idea was more that the spirit of the deceased mother would be able to accompany and advise her son. Now, the head and chin are framed by alternated stylized mudfish and heads of Portuguese, and so I'm referring to these details here at the bottom as well as here at the top. And here's an enlargement figure, so we see the mudfish here with the tail, and these are the stylized heads of the Portuguese. Now remember that the Portuguese gave Benin the royalty brass, so this was an important connection. And in this box here, it's actually shaped like a palace, a royal palace. It was actually cast before the British burned down the palace, and so it is a valuable piece for architectural historians who use it to put together what Benin's architecture may have looked like. Now the box depicts Portuguese mercenaries at the ready on the top of the royal palace. So we see these two figures here with rifles, as well as eagles, who were also birds that were supposed to protect and represent the Oba. Now, Portuguese traders supplied Benin with luxury materials for the Oba. So they are kind of symbols of royalty. They also provided the Benin with the support against their enemies, and they also worked for the Oba at times as guards. They were associated with powerful weapons as they supplied firearms and ammunition. And the Portuguese also captured and sold Benin's enemies into slavery. So for the people of Benin, or for the Oba in particular, the Portuguese were part of symbols of royalty as well. Now here we're looking at a freestanding figure of a Portuguese mercenary, and images such as this one adorn the ancestral altars in the city and the palace roof. They signify the Oba's monopoly over West African trade and the protection he enjoyed throughout his ties with the Portuguese. Now, in addition to sculptures on the roof, the royal palace at Benin also had magnificent brass doors divided by square panels depicting scenes with royal themes. They were prominently displayed on the outer side of the palace doors, and showing these royal symbols of power to the public, reminding them of the Oba's power. These plaques visually recount important events in the history of Benin. Now, creating these palace doors was an act of amazing extravagance. Uh, Brass was a costly luxury material that had many symbolic associations. So it would be kind of like, imagine having the White House's doors covered in casted gold. Now, these doors and the plaques were removed also during the British punitive expedition. Over 900 plaques exist today in the collections of international museums as well as in private collections. Now, the plaque we're looking at on the screen was carved between the 16th and the 17th century. It is only 2 feet square, but it tells a lot about Benin kingship. Now, it is a portrait of an individual king, possibly commemorating a battle, as the figures are dressed for war. Now, the Benin artists use size for hierarchy to identify the rank and importance of the various officials they portray. This plaque is dominated by the figure in the center, which we assume is that of the Oba, who is outfitted for war. He holds a spear here on his right hand and a staff of office on the other, and which communicate that not only he can rule, but he could also defend his people. He is surrounded by warriors and attendants, and their size in the scene probably indicates their lower social status in relation to the Oba. He also wears a sash of ammunition here, and this is the kind of ammunition that would have been come from trade with the Europeans. And he also wears one of the small heads over the nut. So like the one I mentioned in the previous, one of the previous images about the Yoba, the Queen Mother head. So that's what he's wearing here on top of the his outfit. So to conclude, we could say that much of the art we have seen in this lesson deals with the royal house of Edo and Benin, and it serves to announce the power of past and current Oba, both in the form it took as well as in the materials it used. And Benin artists used both local and imported materials to express the importance of the Oba and the sacred nature of his office. Their relationship with European explorers, and the Portuguese in particular, can be seen not only in the materials the Benin artists use, but also in the iconography. Now this concludes our lesson for today.